My name is Robert Monahan, also known as Robin Monahan, and I'm being interviewed today on behalf of, or because I've been an active volunteer with Move to Amend, and Move to Amend is a coalition in the United States of smaller organizations who are demanding a U.S. constitutional amendment that says that only human beings should have constitutional rights and that money is not speech and therefore can be regulated. And how did I get here, you might ask? And part of this will be talking about how Robin Monahan became an activist, because I self-describe myself as being, for 67 years, politically inert. Inert only in the sense of activism. Certainly I would vote in presidential elections and even the off-presidential years, the midterm elections of our representatives. But short of very rarely putting somebody's sign in my yard, I didn't participate in any of the movements. I picked up a copy of the Pentagon Papers released by Daniel Ellsberg and started reading that. Certainly the subject matter was of interest to me because of the time I had served in Vietnam. And it was, my reaction to it was of incredible anger at being sold out by the government. And I think part of the intensity of my anger was because I had so dearly loved the illusion that we were in a democracy, that I was living in a democratic society, democratic republic, if you will, where the people that we elect actually represent the people. That's a wonderful notion. And I enjoyed holding on to that as long as I did. But when we discover that the government is capable of lies and deceit for their own political profit or for the immense financial profit of their corporate sponsors, it's a moment filled with rage when you discover that. So I talked about starting to be more politically aware, especially in terms of use of the military. But all of the other issues, environmental issues and health issues and poverty, the war on drugs, all of those issues were very little interest to me. And part of that was out of a sense that I, as a single individual, was incapable of adding or detracting to all of those decisions that were being made in Congress under guise of representing the people. But in any case, my life played out, middle class. Turns out I became a registered nurse after being a Navy corpsman in Vietnam, and life went along, and raising family, going from job to job, as it were, having hobbies, having kids. There was no need for me, or certainly no energy for me to put into political activities, and certainly not having any interest in it either. But eventually coming into retirement, a little more time. When the Gulf War happened, I was more willing and more interested in looking at the decisions being made in the prosecution of that war, and who was profiting politically or economically. So I had that going on. But essentially my life just rolled along for another decade until January of 2010, when I heard the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission, in which the Supreme Court essentially said that corporations, for the sake of the law, are persons and subsequently entitled to U.S. constitutional rights. And I said, that's absolutely crazy and absurd. There is no need, and in fact, it's totally absurd to give corporations constitutional rights. They already have more legal protections than most human beings. And giving them constitutional rights gives them incredible protections. And with their legal protections and their immortality, it makes, if they are persons, they're certainly super persons to the normal 99% of us that can't afford a lobbyist. In any case, I would describe my feelings similar to Laird's, outrage, disappointment, but my reaction was considerably different. I describe myself as being from Minnesota, and as a Minnesota person, I did what Minnesotans do when we have a strong emotion. We lie down until it passes, which is what I did. But then toward the end of January or early February, Laird calls me and says, I am so damn mad about what the Supreme Court did. I knew what he was talking about. And he said, I'm going to walk across the country and I want you to help me. And I'm thinking, oh, well, good luck with that. But the kind of help he was looking for was the kind of logistical help that I really enjoy, because I have done a lot of wilderness travel and one could call expeditionary travel. I know about feeding groups of people, preparing food in primitive ways or in primitive conditions. And he was asking me to prepare a menu with approximate cost and figure out ways that he could feed a group of people that he would have marching across the country continuously, one after the other, 24 hours a day, getting across 3,000 or more miles in approximately 6 weeks. Could be done. And I'm saying, yeah, well, that'd be fun. That'd be fun. I'd like to go along with that. I could be cook. I could outfit my truck with a mobile kitchen, and I could do meals and go along on this big adventure. And so that's how he hooked me, you know, just an emotional and intellectual hook. But then as he did more and more research and talked to more and more people, it became apparent to him that he wouldn't find 12 people that had the time or the energy or the inclination to do such a walk. Now, in my head, I'm saying, well, if you took enough time and if you canvassed enough people, you could probably do this. But the fact is, neither one of us, being at the time 68 and 71, neither one of us feels as though we have a lot of time. So anyhow, ultimately, he calls me back and said, the good news, we're going to do this walk. The bad news is it's just going to be the two of us. And I said, oh, geez. Having already felt as though I've committed to this thing. But the fact is it changed because it would no longer be 6 weeks. We didn't know how long it was going to take, just the two of us walking. Even taking turns walking, you know. What is that going to look like? The fact is we didn't know. We didn't know if we could do it. We both agreed that we thought we could do it. But in any case, I committed to doing it with him. And eventually he was put in touch with David Cobb, who is a spokesperson and one of the founders of Move to Amend. Coming out of his organization in Northern California is Democracy Unlimited, and that was one of the founding organizations that formed the coalition of Move to Amend. But I had no idea who David Cobb was, or any of the other people or organizations that were even founding members of this coalition. But David invited us to California, and with the idea of giving us a tutorial on how to deal with the press, the media, how to refine our message, and the very important part about refining your message down to the 8-second soundbite, which is often all you get with the media. And that was very good. It was, but leading up to that, during excuse me, during May, April, and March, April, and May, I decided I need to know more about this issue. So I started, got my bibliography together and started reading. And certainly Tom Hartman was a big eye-opener for me. And it's really a well-written book about unequal protection. And it made me realize that we have a multi-tier judicial system, if you will, that depending on where you are on that tier, the consequences are incredibly different. You can rob a bank or shoplift or something and go to jail for many years, or you can, by collusion and swindle, you can use your bank to swindle thousands or millions of people out of billions of dollars and not go to jail at all. Or do only a similar amount of time as if you had shoplifted a pair of blue jeans or something. It's amazing. Anyway, so Laird and I started our walk on May 16th at Golden Gate Park. We wet our feet in the Pacific, started walking. We actually had to walk north first to get out of San Francisco because the Golden Gate Bridge is the only bridge that has a pedestrian walkway. But I could talk about the walk. The walk was incredibly invigorating. We both lost some weight, became physically fit. Our feet became tough after about, depending on who you talk to, we had 5 or 6 weeks of assorted blisters on our feet and then nothing else after that. It took 158 days, if my math is correct, and we ended our walk in the Atlantic Ocean on October 25th. In walking across the United States, I would describe our walk as a team walk. That is, on any given day, Laird and I would each only walk half the miles for that day. And we did that because we're a couple of old guys whose energy is limited. And we took a car with us to hold our camping gear because we did have to camp out. We camped out 21 nights of the 158 nights. There are some places in Nevada and Utah where it's 120 miles between towns. So having camping gear was kind of essential. Otherwise, we would have done a lot of driving without gaining any ground. But on any given day, we would leapfrog the car by driving the car with both of us to the location where we had stopped the day before. And one of us would get out, usually Laird, would get out first in the morning, and he would start walking. And I would drive the car approximately a mile ahead, sometimes more, and find a safe place out of traffic where I would park the car, and then I would start walking. So for much of the time, we were both walking, and the car was parked, and then when Laird would get up to the car, he would get in the car, and he'd drive past me, and about a mile or so past me, he would look for a safe place to park the car, and then he would park the car and get out and start walking. This worked incredibly well because on any given moment you were only maybe 20 or 30 minutes from the car. So in most of the time we didn't have to carry water on our person, and we could walk unencumbered, and it worked really quite well. And also because we were both walking at the same time during at different pieces of the highway, we were able to get our miles in a relatively shorter period of time than if we had just been literally taking turns walking. So that turned out especially fortuitous in the parts of Kansas when it got over 100 degrees by 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. At that time, we would get up usually before sunlight, before sunrise, and we would get to where we had left off, and I would not let us walk until after the sun had started coming above the horizon, because in many places there's very narrow shoulders. The traffic's going by at 65 miles an hour. People driving that time of the day, sometimes coming home from work or ending their night shift, if you will. I just didn't feel it was safe without a little more light, even though we had reflective parts of our safety gear on and we had flashlights with us. So anyhow, we'd start walking just when the sun cleared the horizon, and we could often be done before 10 or 11 o'clock, having gotten our 20 or 25 miles in. I talked about David Cobb teaching us how to condense our message down to the 8-second soundbite, which was not only important for the media, but it was also important to have that 8-second soundbite ready when the highway patrol or the local deputy pulled up and said, "What are you all doing?" And I'm walking across the country to raise people's awareness about the Supreme Court's decision, Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission, in which they said that corporations have constitutional rights. If you say that, the cop right away, he's going to say what? But one of the deputies, within seconds, had moved to amend onto his console inside his squad, and he said, "Oh, wow, you guys are doing great work. Do you have enough water?" And that was usually the case. All of our encounters with any kind of law enforcement were all incredibly positive, friendly, and in some cases helpful. Lots of good stories. One of the things that moved me more than anything else was the incredible kindness of strangers. Using our cars, we did to leapfrog ahead of us and finding a place out of traffic to park. There were at least 5, perhaps 6 occasions when we dropped one or more wheels into the ditch off a culvert, a culvert with grass around it, you're not sure where, and boom, one of your tires, and there's no way that either Laird or I could get the car out. And in every occasion, there was somebody came along within a minute and hooked onto the car or got a group of people together and pushed us out or let us use a cell phone to call somebody. It was incredibly kind, generous. Also, on 65 nights, we spent in what I describe as host housing, where people that we didn't know invited us into their home for at least a bed and sometimes one or more meals. Some of these people we just met on the street on our walk or in a church where we had gone to church on a Sunday, or some of them had heard about us by following the blog, and perhaps as many as half of them were arranged by Move to Amend, who called their various coalition partners and found members living near or close to our walk that would take us in. And just wonderful people out there. It was powerfully uplifting to be held in such high regard and respect and treated so well. That was a big part of the walk for me. Another important part of the walk was coming to the realization that even though I was near the end of a 3,200-mile walk, that it was going to be just a first step. The irony of that was profound for me. Being politically inert in Minnesota, I didn't know what else was going on in Minnesota, but because I never heard about anything on the news about other than a radical group going down to a bridge in Minneapolis and protesting the war that's been going on for many years now. I didn't think there was that there was anything going on about this issue, but I was determined that when I was done with my walk and came back to Minnesota, that I would get behind this issue and do what I could to get people energized behind it and try and do some organizing with my limited skill set. And we did get some things going. I held a rally to celebrate my return in November 6th, at the state capitol steps. We got speakers. Held another rally inside the Capitol Rotunda on January 21st, celebrating the first anniversary of Citizens United. Got some speakers. Got people participating in that. But essentially, for the next 9 months, what I became acutely aware of is that I was a much better walker than an organizer. And I was proud of what I did get done, because I was able to get David Cobb to come and do a Minnesota speaking tour in April of 2011. And then I was able to get him invited back in November of 2011 to speak at the annual celebration of the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, which I became a delegate to as a member of Move to Amend for Minnesota. Anyway, there were other people put in charge, which I was happy to see, people that had much more experience than I doing organization, political organization, if you will. And another wonderful thing that came along in October of 2011 was the Occupy movement, which wearing my Move to Amend button and taking my Move to Amend clipboards down, I participated from day one until the weather got cold, and I played my old man card and didn't go down much anymore. With the Occupy movement, it was a great opportunity to see what other organizations look like, a different kind of movement. Let's call it horizontal leadership, I think is what they call it. Wonderful. Anyhow, it energized me again. But in the meantime, the organizers for Move to Amend were putting a lot more structure into the Minnesota piece of this. And within the early part of 2012, we were able to form affiliate Move to Amend groups in Minneapolis and St. Paul and Duluth and Grand Rapids. And all three out of four are quite active and quite busy doing stuff. And the Twin Cities groups often collaborate on events, and certainly we are in communication often, because some people attend meetings on both sides of the river, if you can imagine doing that in the Twin Cities. totally outlandish, but crossing the river. But, and there's a lot going on. The St. Paul group, for example, does bannering over Interstate 94 twice a month on alternate Fridays. And we've done some street theater, and we've also had David Cobb come back for another speaking tour in Minnesota. And the point is that we are a grassroots movement, and it takes the grassroots means engaging people that are not otherwise identified with a particular movement or organization. One of the key elements of this grassroots movement is education. And that's probably the biggest job, is trying to at least get the vocabulary in front of people to start raising internal questions about what the heck does that mean? Corporate personhood? What does that mean? Get big money out of politics? What does that mean? End corporate rule? What does that mean? These are all little bumper sticker type phrases, but if a person sees them enough times in enough different locations, the intention and the hope is that it will start some curiosity. So that's one of the things. Another thing that we have to work very hard at is growing our numbers by getting people to sign on to the website, movetoamend.org. Getting people to sign up on the clipboard form petition calling for a U.S. constitutional amendment that says only human beings have constitutional rights and money is not speech. Those are essential parts of what Move to Amend is doing nationwide, and certainly here in Minnesota. Eventually, Move to Amend will have to start identifying people running for office who are willing to support the Move to Amend language of a constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment that says only human beings have constitutional rights and that money is not speech and therefore can be regulated. So that needs to happen a little further on down the road. Another thing that's going on is getting municipalities, counties, and states to pass resolutions or referendums that also support such an amendment to the Constitution. So, and another point that needs to be made continuously is that in order to pass a constitutional amendment, we need to link arms with people that don't look like us, people that don't think like us, and frankly, some people that don't have this identical values. But it will take people of all colors, people of all political notions, people of all religious notions to get behind this in order to pass it. And so there's 4 very specific things that Move to Amend is working on: education, growing numbers, passing resolutions, gaining diversity, and the 5th thing is electing officials who support this thing. So for people who are interested in participating, they only need to go to the Move to Amend website and click on the location, the state that you're in, perhaps the municipality, and find out what's going on in your state or what's going on close to you to get participating in Move to Amend. A U.S. constitutional amendment is necessary because the Supreme Court has made a decision. The Supreme Court's decisions are the basis of defining what is law, interpreting what the legislative body puts out, and defining the law. Because they have defined corporate personhood as the law, the only thing that can overturn that is a constitutional amendment. Because the Constitution and its subsequent amendments, of which there are already 27, the Supreme Court has to go with how that's written, and while they can do some interpreting, they can't overturn that. The Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is overturned by constitutional amendments. And I will point to you to two previous bad constitutional amendments. The Dred Scott decision in 1856, and the other decision that said that women did not have the right to vote or the right to sign contracts or something. The word that, or the ruling that comes to mind, or the case that comes to mind, I think it's Plessy versus Ferguson. And I don't know the date. But anyhow, those were two rulings by the Supreme Court that were bad rulings, subsequently found to be bad, that were overturned by a constitutional amendment. The Dred Scott decision was overturned by the 13th constitutional amendment, and the Plessy versus Ferguson decision was overturned by the 19th amendment, which gave women's right to vote. Now, when we talk about corporations having constitutional rights, I used to like to be able to say that there is only one nation in the world that has given constitutional rights to corporations. And when I was saying that, that would be the United States was the only country in the world that has given constitutional rights to corporations. But now, more recently, I have learned that there is now a second country that just recently rewrote its constitution to give, or that included constitutional rights for corporations. And you might ask yourself, what country would that be? Well, that would be the country of Iraq, who rewrote their constitution after being invaded by the United States. And I like to tell the story that they were helped in rewriting their constitution by consultants from, let's say, Halliburton, that helped them rewrite their constitution. I don't know if that's true, but I like to say it. Also, I will point out historically, corporations, if we define them as a charter or even a contract between a government and a private party to conduct business, have been around for over 2,000 years. The word corporation comes from the Latin. And why? Because it was the Romans that invented this artificial being to conduct business. It's a good thing. It's incredibly important. I would say it's essential to our economy. But that they need constitutional rights, I would point you back to 2,000 years of doing and conducting business without constitutional rights. Corporations have done very well without constitutional rights. Corporations do not have and should not have constitutional rights. Because when they have constitutional rights, the same as human beings, it makes them superhumans. For example, I will point out, among the things that make them superior to human beings is Things like immortality. I don't know how immortal you're feeling, but I haven't felt immortal since I got on the plane leaving Vietnam. Another thing is corporations have the protection of limited liability. Do you have limited liability? I don't, as a person, I don't think so. In fact, I know so. Anyhow, they have legal protections and privileges that make them far superior to human beings, and they do not need constitutional rights to make them totally unmanageable or unregulated. A person might question why the Citizens United case was important. Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. What the Supreme Court said in the ruling of that was that corporations with constitutional rights had the right of free speech, which is the First Amendment, and subsequently corporations could not be limited in the amount of spending that they make toward a political candidate or a legislative issue. And because corporations, the transnational corporations, have a large amount of money, and what they have found is that by influencing Congress with some of that money, by campaign financing, for example, it makes the recipients of their sponsorship sensitive to passing the legislation that the transnational corporations want passed to enhance their profit by deregulating or by limiting somebody else's participation in the marketplace, or by taxing other aspects of our lives that wouldn't affect them. These are all ways the transnational corporations have of increasing their profits. Corporations should be making profits, but when those profits are made at the expense of our environment, our health, our civil rights, the safety of our workers in this country and the safety of workers in other countries, this is not a good thing. This is very bad for we the people. It's good for corporations, but bad for we the people. And at the moment, we no longer live in a democracy, even though we participate in elections. The people that we elect do not represent we the people. The people we elect represent the corporations, their corporate sponsors. And whether you vote either major party, it doesn't matter, because both parties very often receive money, often from the same corporations, but sometimes different corporations. But the point is, the people we elect have corporate sponsors and pass legislation favorable to their corporate sponsors and not for the benefit of we the people, and oftentimes to the harm of we the people. If you look at genetically modified organisms, for example, in most of the industrialized nations, in fact, I think I will be so bold as to say all of the other industrialized nations have made it their labeling laws to label genetically modified or foods with genetically modified organisms in them. The United States, no, we don't do that, because our agribusiness corporations have got our legislators to pass legislation that prevents that from happening. So for an individual, if you like the idea of being represented by the person you vote for, with corporations have unlimited amount of spending in an election, for example, the person who wants to vote and have his vote mean something doesn't get it. He will not be represented. The fact that corporations control our government with money, and I will say all three branches of our government are controlled by transnational corporations with financial influence, control our government. We are no longer governed by the people we elect. We are governed by corporations for their own profit. This is a bad thing. There have been several historical precedents for overturning this, what the Supreme Court has said with a constitutional amendment. What comes to mind first is the Dred Scott decision of 1856, where the Supreme Court said that slaves are not persons, and slaves in fact are property and do not have constitutional rights. That was overturned with the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, and later the 14th Amendment, which required equal protections under the law for black men. Another amendment, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, overturned previous rulings of the Supreme Court that prevented women from voting. So there's three instances of a constitutional amendment overturning what the Supreme Court has said. And I will point out that all of those constitutional amendments gave people constitutional rights. But for corporations to have constitutional rights, looking at the Citizens United decision, it only took 5 Supreme Court justices to give corporations constitutional rights. And that's just totally absurd and needs to be overturned with a constitutional amendment.